Hello, bioethics students. I wanted to give a short review lecture to talk about the semester and help you prepare for the final exam. So, this semester we talked about lots of different things. We began the semester by talking about the philosophical foundations of bioethics. We looked at arguments, argument maps, and different types of arguments, and moral theories. Then we moved on to talk about microbes, what our bodies are made of, and how each of us really is a collection of individuals rather than just one individual. Then we went through and talked about 4 different categories: age, race, sex, gender, and ability, as you remember. I have my assistant here with us, so I'm a bit distracted, that's why. All right, so to begin with the philosophical foundations of bioethics, we started out by talking about arguments. We looked at 2 different types of arguments: inductive arguments and deductive arguments, and we said that the difference is in the structure of those types of arguments. An inductive argument is based on probabilities, which means that what an inductive argument is aiming for is for the truth of the premises to make the conclusion very likely, very probably true. We talked about different types of inductive arguments: arguments by analogy, enumerative inductive arguments, and abductive arguments, which you can go back and review all those types and the different criteria for success of those different kinds of arguments, how to evaluate an inductive argument depends on what type of argument it is. And then we talked about deductive arguments, where deductive arguments have a special feature called deductive validity, which means that if the premises are true, the conclusion has to be true. That's guaranteed 100%. It doesn't mean you can be certain that the conclusion is true. You can always be uncertain of any argument, just like you can be uncertain of a math equation, even if the equation is correct. So, but a deductive argument means that if the premises are true, there's a 100% guarantee that the conclusion is going to be true. The relationship between the premises and the conclusion of a deductively valid argument is called logical entailment. So with deductive arguments, we're actually looking for the premises to logically entail the conclusion. We looked at examples of different types of deductive arguments here. We talked at length about different types of deductive arguments and deductive argument structures. Excuse me. And then we looked at different types of inductive arguments and what it takes to strengthen an inductive argument. To make an inductive argument strong means that the truth of the premises makes the conclusion very likely. The stronger the inductive argument, the more likely the conclusion is to follow from those premises. And we looked at argument mapping. Here are 2 types of argument maps. This one where each premise provides independent support for the conclusion. That's why the arrows are drawn independently from each premise. What the arrow represents a reason for believing. So if you have, can you stop doing that? If you have an arrow pointing from a premise to the conclusion, that means the premise provides a reason for believing the conclusion. And since none of the numbers have pluses between them, that means that the premise offers support for the conclusion, in this case, all by itself. If you took away the other premises, the remaining premise would still offer some support for the conclusion. As opposed to this argument, which requires a plus between the premises because these premises work together to support the conclusion. If you took one of these premises away, then the argument wouldn't work anymore. The other premise would not by itself provide support for the conclusion. So we used argument mapping to trace the structure of the arguments that we read in class, almost all of them that you did with your different groups. And we started out using argument mapping to talk about arguments about mental health resources on campus, as you know. And then we moved on to talk about moral theory. We looked at this organizing question, central question of the moral theories are answering, which is there some objective moral standard, some standard for what's right and wrong outside of what we believe to be the case about what's right and wrong? We looked at 2 theories that say there is no objective standard: ethical subjectivism and relativism. And then we looked at 4 different versions of theories that believe in the existence of objective facts, some objective determinant of what constitutes morality, what makes something right or wrong. And just as an overview, each of the philosophical theories we looked at, we started with the sentence, incest is wrong, and we looked at the different ways the theories would interpret this sentence. So the subjectivist would say, I don't like incest. The relativist would say, we don't like incest, because they're appealing to the norms of the culture. The utilitarian believes that incest does not promote the greatest happiness. If incest is wrong, that's what it means for the utilitarian. The Kantian interpretation of incest is wrong means incest does not satisfy the categorical imperative. Okay, just a second. Can you get it?
No.
Why? All right. The virtue ethicist thinks of ethics in terms of people's character, in terms of virtues, having good, positive habits. They would interpret incest as wrong as good people don't do it, where the focus is really on what it takes to be a good person. And incest is wrong, and the feminist ethics of care interpretation would be something like incest doesn't fit within the context of caring relationships. All of these are just a really rough analysis, a really sort of oversimplified explanation of how to think about the different ways that all of these different theories interpret morality. And the authors of the essay that we read about moral theory in the introduction to bioethics say that there are 3 constraints that a moral theory has to meet. The first is that facts have to be relevant. You have to be able to issue facts in support of a particular ethical view. There has to be room for disagreement, that if 2 people have opposing ethical viewpoints, that they actually are in a state of disagreement where, in theory, talking and giving reasons and arguments, this brings us to the next criterion, but there must be some kind of ability to disagree and converse and change our minds on the basis of good reason, like most robust disagreements really allow for. Then we moved on to talk about the nature of our bodies and our microbiomes. We looked at 3 different perspectives of what it is to have a microbiome, how we can characterize the relationship between a person and their microbiome, and how these different perspectives offer different views about what constitutes a person's health and the health of their microbiome. So whether we should think of ourselves as healthy independently of our microbiome, or whether our microbiomes are a constitutive part of that health, or whether there's something separate that just benefits us, like in the ecosystem services perspective. And if you have a microbiome that's not fulfilling its functions, like functions that it aids in digestion or in fighting off disease, if it's not able to fulfill that, is the microbiome itself unhealthy? Do you have an unhealthy microbiome, the way we might say you have an unhealthy heart? Or is there a better characterization of that relationship? So we looked at those types of questions, which really, I think, tie in the stuff about moral theory, because we looked at feminist critique of existing moral theories of being overly individualistic, and then we can see perspectives of health as also being overly individualistic if they ignore this component of our bodies that is constituted by other organisms, and a more holistic approach in ethics, like recommended by the feminist ethics of care, might have a different analysis of how to understand our obligations and our roles within a community of organisms, not just within our skin barriers, but the community of organisms that we're part of in our society and our ecology, how our health is all bound up in that. And so taking an ethical perspective of health and disease requires that we appreciate that complexity and take that kind of holistic picture. And I think that the focus on the microbiomes really allows us to expand our thinking about what constitutes an individual, and then how we make sense of individual obligations and ethical commitments, and the ethics of our culture and our society and our medical care system, when we take that more holistic perspective that recognizes that each of us even isn't a single individual. We looked at different interpretations of health in understanding the role of the microbiome and trying to characterize the microbiome as something as healthy or unhealthy. And this was just the beginning of really challenging ourselves to think about what health actually is, what it consists in, and what it means to be healthy or unhealthy. And this is a question that came up repeatedly throughout the semester. So I think the microbiome is also a good place to sort of start thinking about some of those questions for those reasons as well. Then we moved on to talk about age. We read an article, the Children in Health article, that said that children are embodied, enacted, and situated, and that this leaves them uniquely vulnerable and warranting distinctive medical approaches because of it being embodied, enacted, and situated. And we talked about what each of those terms means and how that affects children's situations, especially when children become ill and become patients in healthcare, how those facts about children really affect what sort of treatment they ought to receive and how children ought to be incorporated in their own healthcare decisions, and all kinds of questions related to children and health that we looked at in that article. So embodied means that they have bodies and their bodies are constantly changing, and this raises challenges for how we think about disease and how we analyze disease. You made a big tower of blocks. Speaking of children, we're talking about children, so look at that tower of blocks. Children are enacted, which means adults make decisions for them because they have limited decision-making capacities, but that blanket statement is really an oversimplification, and children are often treated unjustly because of that enactment, because adults have to make decisions for children. In some cases, we need to ask careful questions about when that decision-making capacity power should be limited and when children should be able to participate in their own decision making, and how we can respect children's capacities in a healthcare setting and not just ignore their own perspectives because they're young and sort of dismiss them out of hand even when they're experts on their own bodies and their own feelings. So we talked about all of those issues and why it gets really complicated when you're making healthcare decisions for children. We talked about HPV, which I think is on a slide coming up, but all of those things get really complicated because you have these small people who are constantly changing, and along with their bodies constantly changing, their capacities are changing. And it needs to be pointed out that children also have some superior capacities to adults that are diminish as the child ages, which we talked about in class. And those advantages, those sort of superior capacities, can also be important to making healthcare decisions for children. So whole vast terrain of complicated questions and stuff that came up around children. Their situatedness means that they're situated within families, a culture, a language, a history, and that affects also how healthcare should be given to children, because when you work with a child, you're really working with the whole family, and how the treatment gets taken up and what values the parents have, those can all affect how the child ought to be treated. So, and related to all this material was the idea of epistemic injustice. We looked at two kinds of epistemic injustice, testimonial and hermeneutical, and how those affect how children become enacted, how we make decisions on their behalf by ignoring or dismissing their own capacity for knowledge and their own sort of position as knowers. So we deny that they can know. We undermine their own testimonies, even about their personal experiences, and that affects how we provide treatment and is a form of injustice. Epistemic injustice is when any group of people have their knowledge discounted on the basis of their membership in that group. So we saw this same concept again coming up again and again with all the different oppressed groups that we looked at throughout the semester.
I'm making a river.
A river?
Yeah.
That's cool. Then we talked about business garden within a garden.
I'm making a hotel.
A hotel?
Yeah.
That's cool too.
I am making.
How we're each a collection of organisms, like we talked about with microbes, and how we're also an organism that exists within multiple other organisms, And we have this collectivist approach to vaccination, which sees decisions about vaccination not just as decisions that affect only the individuals who are making the decisions, but affect the whole society, because the vaccination rates of the people around you affect your own health, and possibly in some cases even more so than your own decision to vaccinate or not, with some diseases. So we really have to think about our collective health, and this is just another way of drawing our attention towards that, towards health as a collective concept, and seeing how our health is intertwined with everyone else in our communities. And we talked about different models of medicine and Biss's third way maternalism, this idea that with children at least, there should be a triangular relationship between the physician, the parent, and the child, which offers every person a chance to participate and to be heard and to have their views taken seriously in that decision making. And I think this can be easily oversimplified, which may have been something that some of you did in your papers, is sort of oversimplifying this idea that we can just include everyone. You see, like a 3-year-old might not necessarily have a role to play in that kind of decision making, but how we do that is still complicated, even if we're working with this maternalistic model, and still going to depend on the age and the capacities of the particular child. Okay, then we moved on to talk about race. We talked about the normativity of whiteness in bioethics, how bioethics has been dominated by white people, how white people have set the agendas and the values and even the language of bioethics, and how that leads to, reinforces itself. It leads to more whiteness being dominant within the field, and it excludes other voices. And this is the article from Miser, who also talked about how attempts to include other people's voices re-inscribe white supremacy, because you still leave that hierarchical sort of white center intact as you sort of seek to go out and incorporate voices that are different from that white center. You end up re-inscribing that center. So, and whiteness, Miser claimed, is not skin color, it's a position in a racial hierarchy. So understanding what whiteness is in the first place and why it's been normative within bioethics. And Miser also has ideas for how to undo that and how to make a more just, accessible, inclusive field of bioethics, which represents different types of people's values and ethical ideas. We talked about weathering, the experience of Black women experiencing racism throughout their entire lives in America, and this having detrimental effects on their birthing outcomes. And we talked about 2 Black women in particular, Simone Landrum, who was the featured in the New York Times piece about the maternal health crisis facing Black mothers, and Henrietta Lacks, whose cells were taken against her knowledge and used to raise. You made so many blocks in that hotel. How her cells were used against her knowledge and used to raise billions of dollars for pharmaceutical companies, while her family, her descendants, were still living in poverty. And we talked about what it means to have just compensation for biospecimen donors, how her race impacted the way that the whole thing played out, and what ought to be done about it, and what ought to be done going forward for people who donate their cells. Then finally, we talked about ability, and we really used this section to look at the nature of the concepts that we use to describe ability and disability. We looked at Scully and Barnes's 2 views about what a disease is in the first place and what is a disability. Barnes, who took up a stance in this question of whether disability is merely a difference maker or should be seen as an inherently negative difference maker, and both of these have problems. A difference maker view, then the person who believes it's merely a difference maker, like Barnes herself, needs to say, then why would it be wrong to cause someone to have a disability, which seems wrong. But the people who believe disability is a negative difference maker need to say why some people are pleased with their disability. How do we have an account of disability that takes seriously the testimonies of disabled people who feel like their disabilities are an important part of their identity? You can do that, but you have to go in the other room if you're going to make noise, because I need to be heard on the video. we're almost done. I'm almost done. You have to take that in another room if you want to play with it. All right. I thought we were on the last category, but there's one more: sex and gender. So we talked about if men could menstruate. What is Steinem's conclusion? So we talked a lot about what Steinem's conclusion is. The group that analyzed this argument did a great job of laying that out. But I want to remind you that Steinem's conclusion is not about what the world would be like if men could menstruate. She's not talking about that alternate reality, really. I mean, she uses that alternate reality to make a point about our own actual world. So I want to encourage you to make sure you know what is her claim about the actual world that we live in and the way power gets defended and propped up. We talked about sexism in medicine, the way that male bodies are seen as a norm or standard of disease when studying diseases, and that leads physicians to not really have a clear idea of many diseases that affect women primarily, or even diseases that affect everyone, how those diseases manifest in women's bodies. And we talked about the underfunding of women's diseases, diseases that affect women. In particular, you can't play music while I'm doing this. Thank you. And then we looked at the article, the image, the diagram of a clitoris and a vulva, and talked about ignorance about female bodies and how that perpetuates these kind of injustices in healthcare, and why women don't even know about their own bodies, let alone physicians understanding how the differences, how sex differences affect disease and wellness. Make sure you're familiar with these diagrams. And we talked about abortion. We looked at an article that abortion is usually permissible by Thompson, who uses all these examples to argue that. And we looked, it's on the chair in my room, at a view that abortion is almost never permissible by Don Marquis, and he appealed to a future like ours and the fact that when you abort a fetus, you're taking that away from the fetus. It doesn't matter how young the fetus is, as long as it's a fetus, you know, as once it's an embryo, it's an entity that has a potential future, and so it's wrong to take that away, according to Marquis. And we talked about intersexuality. Intersex means you're born with biological traits that are outside the strict male-female binary. It could be a fact about your genitals, your anatomy, your chromosomes, your hormones. It's not the same as being transgender. That's a separate idea about how you experience your gender and express your gender. So intersex is about your biology. And we read an article that said that interventions as drastic as intersex surgeries should only be performed when there is strong evidence that they are, all things considered, beneficial and not harmful. That was the main claim of this article, but the real contentious part of this is to decide when is an intersex surgery beneficial and not harmful, and that's what physicians and the medical community and intersex activists, they all disagree about that. So we looked more closely at that question, and that question itself brings us back to all the issues of the semester, really looking at what it means to be healthy and how we should characterize differences between us, differences in our bodies, and when those differences should constitute something negative and when they should just be embraced by society as a form of difference. And these are all complicated questions that really were reappeared throughout the entire course of the semester. I think I'll leave you with this quote. We've been raised in a world that makes us feel like monsters. This person is speaking to intersex individuals. And my advice to other intersex people is to love and accept. So that's kind of where that article ended up. And the author there was making exceptions for cases where society was so hostile towards intersex people that not having the surgery might leave one in the face of more danger. But I'll leave you with that. I hope you had a great semester. I really liked teaching this class and talking about all this stuff, which we could go on talking about. Nothing that we discussed, I think, was wrapped up. You know, we didn't complete any of these discussions. All of these ideas need more thinking and more, people who are dedicated and passionate about this stuff, putting their minds to it and trying to figure out some of these really complicated questions so that we can have better health and better healthcare and a better society. So I hope that you enjoyed this class, and I am available to support you as you prepare for the exam. I'll be grading your papers, and if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out or just want support or anything. I'm here to support. So I'll be available if you want to meet, or we can just email, or whatever you want. So thank you for a great semester, and I'll see you later.